Chapter 49. Then, said Beauchamp, continuing his narration of these events to Albert, I slipped out of the chamber without being seen. The usher who had allowed me to enter was waiting for me at the door. He led me through the corridors to the small door opening into the Rue de Vaugirard, but it was full of both grief and admiration, Albert. Grief for you and admiration for that young woman pursuing her father's vengeance. Albert had been holding his head between his hands. He looked up, his face red with shame and bathed in tears, and gripped Beauchamp's arm. My friend, he said, my life is finished. All that remains for me now is to discover the man whose enmity has pursued me. Then when I know who that man is, either I will kill him or he will kill me. I count on your friendship to help me, Beauchamp. If contempt hasn't killed it in your heart. Contempt, my friend? How has this disaster touched you? No, thank God we no longer live in the days when an unjust prejudice held a son responsible for his father's actions. You're young and rich, Albert. Leave France. Everything is quickly forgotten in this modern Babylon with its agitated existence and changing tastes. Come back in 3 or 4 years, and everyone will have ceased to think about what happened yesterday. Thank you for your good intentions that dictate your words, replied Albert, but I can't do as you say. You understand why it's impossible for me to see this matter from the same point of view as you. If you're still my friend, as you say you are, help me to find the hand that dealt the blow. So be it then, said Beauchamp. If you're determined to go in search of your enemy, I'll go with you. Good. Let's begin our search immediately. Each minute of delay is an eternity for me. The denouncer isn't punished yet, but if he's hoping he won't be, I swear on my honor that he's mistaken. All right, then listen. Oh, Beauchamp, I see you know something. That makes me want to live again. I won't say that this is the whole truth, but at least it's a ray of light in the darkness. I didn't want to tell you before, but I've learned that Monsieur Danglars recently questioned his correspondent in Yanina about Ali Pasha's betrayal. Danglars? Cried Albert. Yes, he's been jealous of my father for a long time. He claims to be a man of the people, yet he can't forgive the Count of Morcerf for being a peer of France. The way he broke off my engagement to his daughter without giving any reason, yes, he's the one. Don't allow yourself to be carried away in advance, Albert. First, make inquiries, and if it's true, he'll pay me for everything I've suffered. Albert, I'm not condemning your decision. I only want to make sure you act cautiously. Oh, don't worry. Besides, you'll go with me. A matter that serious must be dealt with before a witness. If Monsieur Danglars is guilty, either he or I will be dead before the end of the day. Once such a resolution has been made, it ought to be acted on at once. Let's go to see Monsieur Danglars. When they arrived at the banker's residence, they saw the carriage of Monsieur Andrea Cavalcanti before the door. That's good, said Albert. If Monsieur Danglars is unwilling to fight me, I'll kill his son-in-law. A Cavalcanti probably won't refuse a duel. When Albert's visit was announced to him, Danglars, knowing what had happened the day before, gave orders not to admit the young man. But it was too late, for Albert had followed the servant. When he heard Danglars give his order, he forced open the door and, followed by Beauchamp, entered the banker's study. What do you mean by this? Cried Danglars. Doesn't a man still have the right to decide whom he wants to receive into his own house? No, Monsieur Danglars, said Albert coldly. There are certain situations, and this is one of them, in which, unless a man is a coward, he must be at home to certain persons. What do you want with me? Albert stepped forward without appearing to pay any attention to Cavalcanti, who was standing beside the fireplace. I want to make an appointment with you, he said, in some isolated spot where no one will disturb us for 10 minutes or so. A spot where, of the 2 men who meet there, one will remain behind on the ground. Danglars turned pale. Cavalcanti made a movement. Albert turned to the latter and said, Oh, you can come too if you like, Monsieur Cavalcanti. You're almost one of the family, so you have a right to be there, and I make appointments of that kind with as many people as are willing to accept them. Cavalcanti looked in bewilderment at Danglars, who, making an effort, stood up and stepped between the 2 young men. Albert's attack on Andrea put things on another footing, and he hoped that the reason for Albert's visit was different from what he had supposed at first. Let me warn you, Monsieur de Morcerf, he said, that if you come here to pick a quarrel with Monsieur Cavalcanti because I preferred him to you, I will take the matter up with the public prosecutor. You're mistaken, Monsieur Danglars, said Albert with a somber smile. Marriage is the furthest thing from my mind, and I address Monsieur Cavalcanti only because he seemed for an instant to have the intention of intervening in our discussion. You're right in a way, though. I'm ready to pick a quarrel with anyone today, but don't worry, I'll give you priority over everyone else. Monsieur Morcerf, said Danglars, pale with anger and fear. If I find a mad dog in my path, I will kill it. And far from being guilty about it, I feel that I have rendered a service to society. If you are mad and try to bite me, I warn you that I will kill you without pity. Is it my fault that your father is dishonored? Yes, cried Albert. It is your fault. Danglars stepped back. My fault, he exclaimed. Why, you're mad. What do you know about Greek history? Have I ever been in that country? Was it I who advised your father to surrender the castles of Yanina, to betray? Silence, said Albert. No, you weren't directly responsible for the disaster that occurred yesterday, but it was you who hypocritically provoked it. Where did the revelation come from? It seems to me that the newspaper told you that. From Yanina. Yes, but who wrote to Yanina? Yes, but who wrote to Yanina for information about my father? Anyone can write to Yanina, can he? But only one person did write, and that person was you. I wrote, it's true. But it seems to me that when one is about to marry one's daughter to a young man, one has the right to ask for information about that young man's family. In fact, it's not only a right, but a duty. When you wrote to Yanina, said Albert, you knew perfectly well what answer you would receive. I would never have written it if I had known that. How could I have known about Ali Pasha's disaster? Did someone else urge you to write then? Yes. Who was it? Tell me. I was speaking with a certain person about your father's past, and I mentioned that the source of his fortune had always remained obscure. The person asked me where your father had made his fortune, and I answered that it was in Greece. Very well, then, he said. Write to Yanina for information. And who was that person? It was your friend, the Count of Monte Cristo. Albert and Beauchamp looked at each other. Monsieur Danglars, said Beauchamp, who had remained silent until then, you've just accused the Count, but he's absent from Paris right now and therefore unable to defend himself. I'm not accusing anyone, replied Danglars. I'm only telling what happened. And I'll be glad to repeat what I've said before the Count of Monte Cristo when he returns. Does the Count know what answer you received? Asked Albert. I showed it to him. Did he know that my father's name was originally Fernand Mondego? Yes, I told him that a long time ago. In this whole affair, I did only what anyone else would have done in my place, and perhaps much less. The day after I received the answer from Yanina, your father came to see me, at Monte Cristo's urging, to conclude the arrangements for the marriage between you and my daughter. I refused, it's true, but I refused without any explanation, and without making any scandal. And why should I have made a scandal? What does the Count of Morcerf's honor or dishonor mean to me? It neither increases nor decreases my income. Albert flushed. He could no longer doubt. Danglars was defending himself basely, perhaps, but with the assurance of a man who was telling, if not the whole truth, at least part of it. Besides, Albert cared little about establishing the precise degree of guilt of Danglars or Monte Cristo. What he sought above all was a man who would answer for his offense, a man who would fight a duel with him, and it was obvious that Danglars would not fight. Furthermore, a number of forgotten or previously unnoticed things now came back to his mind. Monte Cristo knew everything, for he had bought Ali Pasha's daughter, and knowing everything, he had urged Danglars to write to Yanina. Finally, he had taken Albert to Normandy with him just at the moment when he knew the disaster was about to occur. It was now clear to Albert that Monte Cristo had planned everything and that he was in league with his father's enemies. Albert drew Beauchamp into a corner and communicated all these ideas to him. You're right, said Beauchamp. Monsieur Danglars is only a tool in what happened. He must demand satisfaction from the Count of Monte Cristo. Albert turned to Danglars and said, I want you to understand that I'm not taking final leave of you. I must first know whether your accusations are true, and if I'm going straight to the Count of Monte Cristo to find out. Then, after bowing to Danglars, he walked out with Beauchamp without paying any further attention to Cavalcanti. Danglars showed him the door and assured Albert once again that he bore no personal hatred for his father. Chapter 50. When they had left Danglars' house, Beauchamp stopped Albert and said, Before we go to see the Count of Monte Cristo, I think you ought to reflect for a moment. About what? About the seriousness of what you're doing. I'm afraid only of one thing, finding a man who refuses to fight. Oh, don't worry, said Beauchamp. The Count will fight. In fact, I'm afraid he may fight too well. Be careful. My friend, said Albert with a smile, the most fortunate thing that could happen to me would be to die for my father. That would save all of us. But your mother would die too. Poor mother, said Albert, passing his hand over his eyes. I know that, but it would be better for her to die of grief than of shame. Are you determined to go through with it, Albert? Yes. Then let's go. Where do you think we can find him? He was to leave several hours after I did. He must have returned by now. They drove to the Count's house on the Avenue de Champs-Élysées. They were met with Baptistin at the door. The Count had indeed arrived a short time before, but he was now in his bath and had given orders not to admit anyone. What will he do after his bath? Asked Albert. He will dine, replied Baptistin, and after dinner, he will sleep for 1 hour, and then he will go to the opera. Are you sure? Asked Albert. Perfectly sure. The Count has ordered his carriage to be ready at 8 o'clock. Very well, then, said Albert. That's all I wanted to know. Then turning to Beauchamp, he said, if you have anything to do it now. And if you have an appointment for this evening, postpone it until tomorrow. You can understand why I count on you to go to the opera with me tonight. If possible, bring Chateau Renaud also. Beauchamp took leave of Albert after promising to come by for him at 7:45 that evening. When Albert arrived home, he sent word to Franz, Debray, and Maximilian that he wished to see them that evening at the opera. Then he went to see his mother, who, since the events of the day before, had refused to see anyone and remained in her room. He found her there, still crushed by that public humiliation. The sight of her son produced on Mercedes the effect that might have been expected. She seized his hand and burst out sobbing. Her tears seemed to relieve her. Albert stood silent for a moment, looking at his mother. His expression showed that his resolution to take vengeance was weakening in his heart. Mother, said Albert, do you know if Monsieur de Morcerf has any enemies? Mercedes started. She noticed that he had not said, my father. A man in his position always has many enemies whom he doesn't even know, she replied. Yes, I know that. But I'm sure you've noticed that the Count of Monte Cristo has always refused to eat or drink anything in our house. The Count of Monte Cristo? Exclaimed Mercedes. What connection is there between that and that question you just asked me? As you know, Mother, the Count is almost an Oriental, and in order to maintain full freedom to avenge themselves, Orientals never eat or drink anything in the house of an enemy. Are you saying the Count of Monte Cristo is our enemy, Albert? Who told you that? Why do you say it? You must be mad, Albert. The Count of Monte Cristo has always been friendly to us. He even saved your life once, and it was you yourself who introduced him to us. Oh, if such an idea has occurred to you, forget it at once. Let me advise you, let me beg you, in fact, not to quarrel with him. Mother, replied Albert gravely, you have your own reasons for asking me not to quarrel with that man. I, exclaimed Mercedes, blushing as quickly as she had paled, then almost immediately becoming as pale as before. Yes, replied Albert, and your reason is that he can't do us any harm, isn't it? Mercedes shuddered and looked scrutinizingly at her son. You're speaking to me very strangely, she said. What has the Count done to you? Only 3 days ago you went to Normandy with him. Only 3 days ago I regarded you as you yourself regarded him, as your best friend. An ironic smile passed over Albert's lips. Mercedes saw it, and with her double instinct as a woman and as a mother, she guessed everything. But she carefully concealed her agitation. Albert let the conversation drop. After a time, Mercedes said to him, I wish you'd stay here with me, Albert. I have a great need not to be alone. You know how glad I'd be to stay with you, Mother, but an extremely urgent matter is going to make it necessary for me to leave you for the entire evening. Very well, replied Mercedes with a sigh. I don't want to make you a slave to your filial piety. Albert pretended not to hear, saluted his mother and withdrew. As soon as he had closed the door behind him, Mercedes summoned a trustworthy servant and ordered him to follow Albert all evening and tell her where he went. Then she rang for her personal maid, and despite her weakness, dressed herself in order to be ready for any contingency. The mission she assigned to her servant was not difficult to carry out. Albert went to his house and dressed with careful severity. At 10 minutes to 8, Beauchamp arrived. He had seen Chateau Renaud, who promised to join them in the opera house before the curtain rose. Chateau Renaud was waiting for them when they arrived. Beauchamp had already told him everything, so Albert was not obliged to give him any explanation. Debray had not arrived, but Albert knew he rarely missed a performance of the opera. Albert kept his eyes on Monte Cristo's box, but it seemed to be stubbornly determined to remain empty. Finally, at the beginning of the second act, when he had just looked at his watch for the 100th time, the door of the box opened, and Monte Cristo, dressed in black, entered and leaned over the railing to look down into the orchestra. He was accompanied by Maximilian Rowe. As he glanced around the orchestra, Monte Cristo perceived a livid face with flashing eyes, which seemed to be eagerly trying to attract his attention. He recognized Albert, but the expression he saw on his face advised him not to seem to have noticed him. Without giving any indication of what was going on in his mind, he sat down, took out his opera glasses, and looked in another direction. However, without appearing to see Albert, the Count did not lose him from sight, and when the curtain fell at the end of the second act, his keen eyes followed the young man as he left the orchestra accompanied by his two friends. The Count felt that a storm was about to break, and when he heard the key turning in the door of his box, although he was talking to Maximilian with his most affable expression, he knew what to expect and prepared himself for the worst. The door opened. The Count turned and saw Albert, livid and trembling. Behind him were Beauchamp and Chateau Renaud. "Well, I see you've finally reached your goal," he said with the benevolent politeness which usually distinguished his greetings from commonplace civility of others. "Good evening, Monsieur de Morcerf." Maximilian recalled the letter he had received from Albert asking him without any explanation to go to the opera that evening, and he realized that something terrible was about to happen. "I have not come here to exchange hypocritical greetings or false pretenses of friendship with you," said Albert. "I have come here to demand satisfaction from you." "You come to demand satisfaction at the opera," said the Count, with that calm tone of voice and that penetrating glance which reveal a man who is always sure of himself. "I'm not very familiar with Parisian customs, but I wouldn't have thought the opera was a proper place to demand satisfaction." "When a man hides himself," said Albert, "when he doesn't allow anyone to enter his house on pretext that he's in his bath, at table, or in bed, one must address him wherever he can find him." "I'm not difficult to find. If I remember correctly, you were in my house only yesterday." "Yesterday," said Albert, who was beginning to lose his head. "I was in your house because I didn't yet know who you are." Albert spoke these words so loudly that they were heard by the occupants of the neighboring boxes and the people who were passing in the corridor. "What's the matter with you, Monsieur de Morcerf?" said the Count, without the slightest sign of emotion. "You seem to have lost your reason." "As long as I'm aware of your treachery and make you understand that I want to avenge it, I'm reasonable enough," said Albert furiously. "I don't understand you, Monsieur de Morcerf," said Monte Cristo, "and even if I understood you, you would still be speaking too loudly. This is my box, and I alone have the right to raise my voice here. Get out, Monsieur de Morcerf." And he pointed to the door with an admirable gesture of command. "I'll bring you out of your box," cried Albert, convulsively squeezing his glove, which Monte Cristo had not lost from his sight. "Very well," said the Count calmly. "You want to provoke me to a duel, that's clear enough, but let me give you some advice. It's a bad idea to make so much noise in provoking me. Some people ought not to call attention to themselves, Monsieur de Morcerf." Albert understood this allusion and made a movement to throw his glove in the Count's face, but Maximilian seized his wrist while Beauchamp and Chateau Renaud, fearing the scene might go beyond the limits of a provocation, held him back from behind. But Monte Cristo, without standing up, leaned forward and took the glove from Albert's fingers. "Monsieur de Morcerf," he said in an awesome tone, "I consider your glove as having been thrown, and I will give it back to you with a bullet. And now leave my box, or I will call my servants and have you thrown out." Beside himself with rage, his eyes wild and bloodshot, Albert stepped back. Maximilian took advantage of his movement to close the door. Monte Cristo picked up his opera glasses and began to look through them as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Maximilian leaned close to his ear and asked, "What have you done to him?" "Nothing. Not personally, at least," replied the Count. "His father's misfortune has made him lose his head." "Did you have anything to do with it?" "It was Haydée who told the Chamber about his father's treason." "Yes, I heard that, but I couldn't believe that Greek girl whom I saw with you here in this very box was the daughter of Ali Pasha. And yet it's the truth. Now I understand everything. Albert wrote me a note asking me to come to the opera tonight. He must have wanted me to be a witness to the insult he intended to give you." "Probably," said the Count imperturbably. "But what will you do to him?" "As sure as you're sitting here, I will kill him tomorrow morning before 10 o'clock. That's what I'll do to him." Maximilian seized the Count's hand and shuddered when he felt how cold it was. "But his father loves him so much," he cried. "Don't tell me that, or I'll make him suffer," said the Count, with the first sign of anger he had shown. There was a knock on the door of the box. "Come in," said the Count. Beauchamp entered. Good evening, Monsieur Beauchamp, said Monte Cristo, as though he were seeing him for the first time that evening. Have a seat. Beauchamp bowed and sat down. As you know, Count, he said, I was with Monsieur de Morcerf just now. I admit he was wrong to lose his head in the way he did, and I've come to apologize for him on my own account. Now the apology has been made, and let me repeat that it's mine, not his. I'm sure you're too courteous a man to refuse to give me some explanation about your connections with Yanina and that Greek girl. Monte Cristo made a little gesture which commanded silence. You've just destroyed all my hopes, he said, laughing. What do you mean? Asked Beauchamp. You've been eager to give me a reputation for eccentricity, to depict me as a sort of Manfred or Lord Ruthven. And now the time for regarding me as eccentric has passed, and you want to make me into a vulgar, commonplace man. You even asked me to explain myself. You must be joking, Monsieur Beauchamp. There are certain circumstances, said Beauchamp haughtily, in which honor commands that... Monsieur Beauchamp, interrupted the Count. The Count of Monte Cristo is commanded only by the Count of Monte Cristo. I do as I please, and believe me, it's always very well done. You cannot pay an honorable man in that coin, said Beauchamp. You must give a guarantee to his honor. I'm a living guarantee, said Monte Cristo, his eyes flashing threateningly. Each of us has blood in his veins, which the other is eager to shed. That is our mutual guarantee. Take that answer to Monsieur de Morcerf and tell him that by 10 o'clock tomorrow morning I will have seen the color of his blood. In that case, the only thing that remains to be done is to make arrangements for the duel. That's a matter of complete indifference to me, said the Count. Duels are fought with the sword or the pistol in France. In the colonies, they use the carbine. In Arabia, the dagger. Tell Monsieur de Morcerf that although I'm the insulted party, in order to be eccentric to the end, I'll leave the choice of weapons to him, and that I'll accept anything without question, even combat by drawing lots, which is always stupid. With me, it's different, however. I'm sure to win. Sure to win, repeated Beauchamp anxiously. Of course, said the Count with a slight shrug. Otherwise I wouldn't fight Monsieur de Morcerf. I must kill him, and I will. Just send word to me later tonight to let me know the time and choice of weapons. It will be pistols at 8 o'clock in the morning in the Bois de Vincennes, said Beauchamp, disconcerted, not knowing whether he was dealing with an outrageous braggart or a supernatural being. Very well, Monsieur Beauchamp, said the Count. Now that everything is settled, please allow me to enjoy the rest of the opera and tell your friend Albert not to come back this evening. He would only do himself harm by his rude outbursts. He'll do well to go home and get some sleep. Beauchamp left the box in amazement. Monte Cristo turned to Maximilian and said, I can count on you, can I? Certainly, replied Maximilian, but what? I'd like very much to know the real cause. Do you mean to say you refuse to be my second? Not at all. The real cause, said the Count. Albert himself doesn't know it. The real cause is known only to myself and to God. But I give you my word of honor that God, with his knowledge, will be on our side. It's enough for me, Count, said Maximilian. Who will be your other second? You and your brother-in-law, Emmanuel, are the only two men in Paris to whom I'd like to give that honor. Do you think Emmanuel will accept? I can answer for him as surely as for myself, Count. Good. Come to my house tomorrow morning at 7 o'clock, then. We'll be there.